see in your program, the Honorable Attorney General is the second speaker.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I'd like to, of course, acknowledge the acting Chief Justice, the Attorneys General from the Maldives and also from Palau. I, of course, like to also acknowledge the Chief Registrar, the Director of the Human Rights Commission of Fiji, the Assistant Commissioner of Police, the board members of Legal Aid Commission, of course our partners and collaborators from the EU, the head of corporation and also the head of UNDP, and all the other invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, and of course all the members from the region itself. I do not want to make a very long speech or essentially regurgitate what the other speakers have actually spoken about, and I'm sure all of you are aware of the benefits of legal aid and the rationale behind it. What I wanted to do this morning was essentially to share with you the Fijian experience and perhaps something that we can learn from, and perhaps explain why we have positioned legal aid as a centerpiece of our democratic system. Because the reality of the matter is that you can have what we call substantive democracy or just simply democracy. You could have rule of law, you could have substantive rule of law. You could have justice, or you could have substantive justice. And I think a lot of the times in many jurisdictions throughout the world, there is also a lot of sort of dogma in terms of adherence to these so-called principles. But the actual practical application and implementation within that paradigm is actually missing substantially. So from the Fijian experience, we in fact thought long and hard about it. And when we are in fact formulating the Fijian constitution, in 2013, which was implemented in 2013, we in fact incorporated legal aid within the constitutional provisions. So those of you who are sticklers for various legal acts and provisions and sections, Section 118 of the Fijian Constitution actually creates or continues the formation of the Legal Aid Commission and gives it constitutional authority. What is also really interesting is that within the Constitution itself, there is a requirement that the Parliament must always provide adequate funding to the legal aid. The Parliament also must, when they provide the funding, it also states that the Legal Aid Commission must have authority over its own budget. In other words, we cannot dictate to it how they spend their money. It spends its money based on the constitutional provisions as provided for in the Constitution itself. So they run their own budget, they run their own finances. So what it means, they are completely different to government in terms of having their own procurement systems, in terms of having their own recruitment systems, their own administrative systems. And I think that's very, very pivotal to understand that gives it the true level of independence. They have the ability to advise the Attorney General and keep the Attorney General updated, but that's the extent of the involvement of the Attorney General. The other extent of the involvement of the Attorney General is that the Attorney General actually appoints commissioners to the Legal Aid Commission. And of course, then the commissioners, together with the staff and the management, do their own thing as provided for under the Constitution. Now, furthermore, within the Constitution, of sections 13, 14, and 15, there's specific references to the Legal Aid Commission. So the rights of a person who's detained, rights of a person who's accused, and also access to courts and tribunals. So, for example, under Section 15, access to courts and tribunals, it says that the courts must ensure, for example, that if there is no legal representation, the legal aid must be brought in if they believe that there would be some injustice or carriage of injustice. Equally, if a person is detained, they must be provided with legal aid should they not be able to access those types of services themselves or on their own. And again, persons who are actually accused, they have a right to have legal aid representation should they not be able to provide their own lawyers. So there is a very solid constitutional framework within which the Legal Aid Commission operates. And I think this is again a sort of true fulfillment of the rule of law. I've got some figures here just to sort of give you, contextualize it. In 2006, the Legal Aid Commission had only 3 offices in Fiji, in Suva, Lautoka, and Lambasa, only $400,000 being its budget, annual budget. Today, it has 18 offices throughout Fiji. It's a budget in excess of $4 million. And we have also what we do in the budget, as we have, for example, with the Human Rights Commission, with the Auditor General's Office, with the DPP's office, the Fijian Elections Office. It has what we call a single budget line item. So they allocated the funding. They, of course, talk to the Ministry of Economy in the formulation of the budget. But once they're actually given the funding, they run with their own budgets, as, for example, is the Parliament, as is the judiciary. To sort of contextualize it again, the judiciary just a few years ago, even the staff appointments, not the bench, but even the staff appointments, had to go through the Public Service Commission, right up to positions like the driver or the clerk. And again, the finances were controlled, and we had actual itemized expenditure. Now, if you go to the budget that's delivered in Parliament, the judiciary has a single line budget item. So essentially, they're given the envelope of money, and it's up to the Honorable Chief Justice and his team, the Judicial Services Commission, to actually spend the money as they deem fit to be able to fulfill the constitutional mandate. So I think that's critically important to understand. In particular, I know some of the jurisdictions in the Pacific are developing, their legal aid capacity, and I think it's very important to understand that the independence is critically important, and adequate funding is really, really important also. And that, of course, instills a lot of confidence within the members of the public. Again, to give you some figures, we have, for example, interestingly enough, we have about 3,319 family cases or family law cases before the courts through Legal Aid Commission, 9,967 cases before the courts in the criminal division, and 2,040 in the civil division before the courts. But interestingly enough, and these are 2018 figures, interestingly enough, as far as advice work is concerned, the civil advice is actually the dominant one, which is 51% of all advice work is to civil matters. And family is 33%, and criminal is 16%. What that goes to show is that the sort of redress that members of the public are seeking now, and indeed the services that the Legal Aid Commission must provide, must keep up with the times. So the Legal Aid Commission now in Fiji actually helps people to draft their wills, actually helps people to carry out probate matters in the event of a family member dying. We have, of course, a unique situation in Fiji, for example, regarding land. So you have landlord-tenant rights, and in particular, when you have some tenants that may be marginalized or tenants that may be marginalized, we in fact have provided funding for legal aid to be able to handle those types of matters. So it's a changing nature of society, but I think a lot of people traditionally, when they think of legal aid, they only think about the criminal justice system, but of course there's the family element to it, there's also the civil element to it. And I think for a legal aid organization to be more effective in the modern day 21st century, they need to be able to address those particular facets within the justice system itself. It's not just the criminal justice system. It is critically important because many people don't realize actually that on the ground, when you have family disputes, when there are no wills, when people die interstate, it does create problems too. And in fact, sometimes leads to violence also. People then get caught up in the criminal justice system. So we need to be able to address what are the symptoms that lead to some of these criminal events taking place. So if you're able to adequately address that in the first stop, then you actually stop a number of other mishaps that may occur within society itself. I think from one of the observations that I've had also is it's critically important for us to understand that to be able to address the legal aid and the access to justice, when we talk about that, is that the private bar, the legal practitioners who are not part of legal aid, who are not, for example, within the DPP's office or the Attorney General's office, but the private bar must actually play a pivotal role. And for those of you in the different jurisdictions within the Pacific who are actually developing a legal aid culture, I would urge you to, right from the beginning, to draw in the private bar, those private lawyers. Unfortunately, in Fiji, we have not been able to develop that culture. In fact, that culture has, in fact, been quite seriously affected. Just to give you an example, a couple of years ago, with the assistance of UK and I think also the EU, we had a study team that went across to UK and went across also to one of the other European countries. And unfortunately, we had lawyers from the Legal Aid Commission, from the Attorney General's office, and also from the Fiji Law Society. And when they came back, they were supposed to work together, work with the police in respect of, in particular, the first hour procedure, because as you know, that's where a lot of the issues does arise in terms of the rights of people who are brought before the criminal justice system. Unfortunately, when the project actually commenced in November 2016, the private bar with the Fiji Law Society that represents not all, but some of the private practitioners said, well, how much are we going to get paid for representing people? That, I think, is a huge unfortunate event, because you cannot weigh your ability to access criminal justice system or your ability to participate in it as a lawyer, as a legal practitioner. And, in principle, you have a fiduciary duty to the courts. If you simply are just monetary driven, you must also develop, for example, a roster system. Many jurisdictions do it quite well, and I know in Australia, in one of the states, they do it quite well. They used to, in any case, when I used to practice in Australia, where people would volunteer their services, for example, on weekends or weekdays, and say, look, I'm available, every Tuesday from 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. And people would make themselves available. It's like being on call. We don't have that in Fiji, unfortunately. I think in a very fundamental manner, the Fiji Law Society or its members who are there have abdicated their responsibility. What also I would like to mention is about conflicts of interest. And many of you actually obviously have smaller jurisdictions. It is not actually uncommon that you may have, for example, if it's a family dispute, you may have husband and wife, both of them, who actually will want to seek legal aid advice. They may be separated. They may want to go through divorce proceedings. Both of them may be from low-income families, and therefore both of them are entitled to the services by legal aid. Now, legal aid, of course, has to provide those services. So many jurisdictions, as legal aid has tried to do, is try to, of course, represent one party and maybe outsource the other party's representation. And again, just talking to the legal aid management, unfortunately, that is not working out well too. I mean, just to give you some figures, the brief outs in 2016 was 514, 2017 was 902, and last year was 1,504. But we found on a number of occasions, in fact, it's invariably this is what happens. The representation is not good, lawyers aren't turning up on time, sometimes sort of docking their fees or claiming high amounts of money when they really should not be. So I think the legal aid has now decided to, in many instances, represent both the clients but have some measures put in place and develop specific Chinese walls, so there's no conflicts. Conflicts actually do not arise. That, of course, can pose problems for the organization itself, but unfortunately it is something that it has to deal with. So I would also urge you, some of you who come from smaller jurisdictions, you may not necessarily have enough members of the private bar who can actually do this work. So you will need to develop systems in your own organizations to ensure you have adequate, Chinese walls being built, so you do not have those conflicts that may arise or indeed be accused of that by your respective clients that your organization would be representing. I also just wanted to very briefly mention about what was mentioned earlier on about the development of jurisprudence. I think that's critically important also. We have a fairly robust Bill of Rights in Fiji. And for the first time, we now have a Bill of Rights that actually addresses socioeconomic rights. In recent times, over the past 2 years or so, Fiji has now, through its parliament, approved the ratification of all the 9 core conventions. We've already ratified 7. The last 2 were approved by Parliament. We're going through the ratification process now. Now, what this does, obviously, is that it means that more people will be able to exercise their rights, and of course the country as a whole needs to ensure that it has adequate laws and measures in place to be able to actually adhere to those conventions that it has ratified. Now, in those instances, of course, we need to also ensure that the jurisprudence does develop. We see a huge dearth of jurisprudence in the area of socioeconomic rights. So that is something we need to encourage, of course, and the legal aid sometimes, of course, has also acted against the state and will probably continue to do so. And we have seen that when the private bar is actually not very active in that space, the legal aid organization will actually have to pick up the mantle and provide that intellectual input, provide that input in respect of developing the jurisprudence in those spaces. And I think, as I mentioned earlier on, if you look at the type of advices people are now seeking from the legal aid, a lot of it is slanted towards the civil cases. The ratification, of course, brings about a number of new areas. We have recently, for example, in Fiji, those people who know the Fijian economy would also know that we have had shortage of, for example, highly skilled tradespeople. When we had the earthquake in Christchurch, a lot of our good tradespeople were taken away by the New Zealand government to rebuild Christchurch, which left a huge gap within our industry, construction industry, to have highly trained tradespeople. So we are now seeing more and more Fijian construction companies, for example, bringing in workers from Bangladesh, bringing workers from Philippines, bringing in workers from Indonesia to fill in that gap. Some of them are, of course, very good. We had a huge construction boom, in particular with a lot of private sector and public sector investment in that space. So there's a demand for people in the construction sector. Unfortunately, one of the spillover effects is exploitation of foreign workers. And we've recently seen that. There's a case before, I understand it's before the courts, legal aid was representing them, where you have a group of Bangladeshis who are promised, certain type of privileges and salaries, etc. But when they've come to Fiji, there have been various allegations of ill treatment, mistreatment, non-payment of what they've actually promised. So again, the legal aid actually has to provide those services because nobody else will. So we need to develop a number of measures. How do we protect them, but also for them to be able to get legal recourse? And some of that you may find in your jurisdictions also. And of course, it's now a legal obligation on us to ensure that we adhere to the convention, and also the Legal Aid Commission needs to get on board regarding that. There is, of course, the adoption of technology was spoken about earlier on. Just to contextualize, we have a population of slightly over 900,000 people. We have over 600,000 Facebook users. We have more SIM cards in operation than actual number of people. There are over 1 million SIM cards that are active SIM cards. Of course, like I always say, some people keep more than one, some for legitimate reasons, some for illegitimate reasons. But the reality of the matter is that's the level of ICT penetration in our society. So is your organization able to reach out to those people who are spending probably 80% of the time in front of a phone, or a mobile phone, or do you have enough apps? Are you able to provide those types of services? And I think that's very important for us to be able to understand. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that provides some food for thought in respect of your deliberations over the next couple of days, and areas that you could focus on. In particular, those of you who are looking at, of course, further maturing your services in the area of legal aid. We, of course, are still growing ourselves. We have a number of challenges. As we say, Legal Aid Commission in Fiji is the largest law firm. I think it has over close to 100 professional staff, more than 100 professional staff, then you've got all the support staff. So that, I think, your HR management is critically important, ensuring that there are career paths also. Retention of staff, I think, is very, very important. Retention of staff that actually see legal aid as a career path. You know, we have in Fiji a very high attrition rate, in particular with specialized fields. People tend to poach a lot. So I think those are the kind of challenges internally that you need to develop as an organization. Last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, we are very, very also keen, and I don't just speak for the legal aid, and I dare not speak for the legal aid management and the board, but as a country and as Attorney General of Fiji, we are very keen on regional cooperation. And I think, as highlighted by one of our speakers saying that South-South cooperation is critically important, I think there's a lot we can learn from each other. We, of course, are quite willing to provide different types of relationships. I understand the legal aid has a MOU to Tuvalu in respect to providing services. We like to develop more of that. If there's any way we can help, I hope to spend a bit of time today with you, so please feel free and we can have some discussions as to how we can mature those relationships. And we wish you all the best in deliberations and wish you a very good stay. For those who are visiting Fiji for the first time, Bula Vinaka once again, please enjoy yourselves. It's not only about this room, there's lots of wonderful things happening outside this room, and please enjoy the Fijian hospitality. Vinaka, thank you.